The psychological weight of a missed connection often lingers far longer than the connection itself ever could have, especially when that distance is enforced by centuries of sectarian history. We are looking at a fascinating short story titled Dukh, or An Agony, by Mustafa Sajjad Haider. It presents a narrator who, in his mid-60s, finds himself approached by an Iranian-origin woman of striking beauty, a pariwash, in an adult painting class in London. But instead of a late-life romance, the story pivots into a deep historical anxiety. The narrator rejects her, not because of a lack of desire, but because he sees her through a lens of historical and religious baggage, specifically the legacy of Aurangzeb Alamgir and the Safavid Empire. It is a story where a simple Khuda Hafiz or Allah Hafiz isn't just a goodbye, it is a theological boundary marker.
It is such a dense piece because it uses the internal monologue of a langur, the narrator's self-deprecating term for himself, to explore how the ghosts of the past haunt modern identity. He describes this woman as an impregnable fortress that unexpectedly opens its gates to him. She is elegant, an artist, and yet the moment she offers him companionship, suggesting they spend their days in cafes and galleries, he freezes. The technical breakdown of his panic is incredible. He starts seeing her Iranian heritage and her attire not as personal traits, but as symbols of the Shia-Sunni divide. He begins to project a future where she eventually remembers he is the descendant of Sunnis and usurpers of the caliphate. The tragedy here is that the agony he speaks of is entirely self-inflicted by a mind conditioned by the sectarianism of the Indian subcontinent.
The mention of Aurangzeb Alamgir is where the story shifts from a personal memoir to a socio-political critique. The narrator literally hallucinates a court scene with Aurangzeb. Why do you think the author links a 17th century Mughal emperor to a missed date in 21st century London? It seems like a massive jump, yet for the narrator, it is the root cause of his inability to connect.
It is about the psyche that Aurangzeb helped forge. Historically, Aurangzeb is a polarizing figure. While some see him as a devout ruler, many historians, including those the author aligns with, argue that his imposition of the Sharia-based Fatwa-e-Alamgiri and his suppression of the arts, symbolized in the story by the funeral of music, laid the groundwork for the rigid sectarian identities we see today in South Asia. By forcing a specific religious legalism over a diverse empire, he arguably broke the syncretic fabric of India. The narrator feels that his own identity is so tied to this Alamgiri legacy that he cannot simply be an individual. He is a Sunni first, and she is a Shia Iranian first. He fears her venomous sting of historical revenge, which is a powerful, if paranoid, metaphor for how history prevents human intimacy.
And that linguistic choice he highlights, Khuda Hafiz versus Allah Hafiz, really anchors this. For listeners who might not know the context, Khuda Hafiz was the standard Persian-influenced greeting in the subcontinent for centuries. The shift to Allah Hafiz became a point of contention in Pakistan during the Zia-ul-Haq era in the 1980s, seen as an attempt to Arabize the culture and distance it from Persian or local roots. The narrator notes that she says Khuda Hafiz, marking her as part of that older, perhaps more Persianate tradition, while he responds with Allah Hafiz, which he calls a remnant of Zia-ul-Haq's policies. It is a linguistic wall.
Exactly. Even though he is an artist and she is an artist, they are trapped. The author mentions that she wears a black abaya and covers her hair so not a single strand shows. To the narrator, this isn't just modesty, it is a sign that she is still living in a centuries-old civilization. He is terrified that her religious identity will eventually wake up and demand retribution for Karbala or the early caliphate disputes. It is a classic case of what sociologists call path dependency. The decisions of a ruler 300 years ago, like Aurangzeb, or 40 years ago, like Zia, have limited the choices this man feels he can make in a London library today. He chooses loneliness over the potential conflict of their combined histories.
But isn't there a deep irony in his shukr, his prayer of thanks, for escaping? He says he offered a sajda-e-shukr for saving his life from this serpent, yet he spends the rest of the story lamenting the loss. He calls himself a langur who lost a whore. The self-loathing is palpable. He blames the Safavids in Iran and Aurangzeb in India for ruining his chance at happiness. Is the author suggesting that our religious and national identities have become prisons?
Absolutely. The tragedy is that the agony isn't just about the woman, it is about the death of the self as an independent agent. He can't just be a 65-year-old man who likes painting. He has to be a representative of an entire lineage. The author's critique of Aurangzeb is particularly sharp here. He mentions that even Aurangzeb, in his final days, expressed regret about spending his whole life on Arabic and rigid legalism. There's a historical basis for this. Aurangzeb's final letters to his sons express a sense of failure and a realization that the empire was fracturing under the weight of his policies. The narrator is living out that fracture on a personal level.
It is also worth noting the cultural impact of these shifts. The story mentions the rise of sectarian groups, Barelvi, Deobandi, even the Taliban, as the ultimate fruit of the seeds sown by the Fatawa-e-Alamgiri. By framing a romantic rejection as a consequence of 17th century jurisprudence, the author makes the abstract political very personal. The narrator is so colonized by these historical fears that he perceives a kind woman as a potential Nagin or female cobra. It's a vivid illustration of how prejudice functions as a survival mechanism that actually destroys the quality of life.
And the fact that this happens in London is significant. They are in a neutral space, a library, an art class, places of enlightenment and creativity. David, the teacher, doesn't even need to show his degrees because his art speaks for itself. That is the ideal, to be judged by your work and your character. But the narrator cannot enter that world. He is stuck in the dark future Aurangzeb left behind. He even admits he didn't hear what she was saying because his mind was filled with storms. He was literally deafened by his own historical anxieties.
The ending is quite poignant. He apologizes to her through this writing 16 years later. It's a confession. He acknowledges that she was likely hurt by his coldness, his beruki. He realizes now that he was a langur, an ugly, stumbling creature who was offered heaven and ran away because he was afraid of the ghosts of his ancestors. It really makes you wonder how many modern relationships are sabotaged by these deep-seated, often unexamined historical grievances.
It highlights a very specific type of South Asian melancholy. The Dukh isn't just grief, it's a realization of wasted potential. If the syncretic traditions of the past, the ones Aurangzeb famously tried to bury, had survived, this narrator might have seen a companion in that woman instead of a sectarian threat. The story argues that the imposition of a singular, rigid religious identity by the state eventually trickles down into the smallest human interactions, robbing people of the ability to love across boundaries.
It's a heavy reflection on how we carry our history, whether we want to or not. The narrator's struggle with Allah Hafiz versus Khuda Hafiz is a perfect microcosm of that. One represents an imposed, modernized religious identity, the other, a more traditional, cultural one. By using these as metaphors, the author shows that even our greetings can be battlegrounds.
Ultimately, the story is a call to recognize these invisible chains. The narrator is miserable because he chose the security of his sectarian fortress over the vulnerability of a real human connection. He saved his life, but lost his soul in the process. It's a powerful warning about the long-term effects of state-sponsored fundamentalism on the individual psyche.
The legacy of Aurangzeb and the sectarian divisions that followed are not just chapters in a history book, they are lived experiences that continue to shape personal destinies. This story serves as a stark reminder of how the past can reach out and stifle the present if we don't actively work to dismantle the prejudices we've inherited. If this exploration of history, identity, and missed chances resonated with you, consider sharing it with someone who appreciates the intersection of literature and social critique.